This image is a portrait of Jesus called Jesus of the People. I often show it to my students when we talk about James Cone and some of his theological arguments about the race of Jesus in our current context. Who is Jesus today? If we were to encounter Jesus today, what would Jesus look like? If Jesus is one of the oppressed, right? If Jesus is one of the oppressed in our community, this might be one way to portray Jesus. We're not used to seeing Jesus this way. We're used to seeing a very Anglo Jesus, Jesus modeled after European features. This goes back to our previous lecture. We talked about how in Europe, the rise of modernity, and even before, how Christianity really divorced itself from its Jewish roots, its Jewish heritage, and completely lost the Jewish identity of Jesus. And so no longer was Jesus portrayed as an ethnic Jew, as a first century Palestinian would have looked, which would be much more Arab-like. We're used to seeing portraits of Jesus with bluish eyes, very pale skin, and golden hair, golden brown hair. So Cone challenges us to rethink how we image Jesus and certainly how we image God in our minds when we pray and so on. We're going to spend most of our lecture here talking about the history, the context of African-American theology, Black liberation theology, including contemporary movements within theology. But obviously this history and these movements are what give rise to Black theology and Black liberation theology. So they're obviously related. It demonstrates the need for theologies that interrogate race, both from the Black community and other communities, including the need for white theologians to address issues of race in their theologies. So here is a list of part of the history. Obviously, over 240 years of slavery, horrific Middle Passage, just horrific dehumanizing treatment. There are obviously many films that I could direct you to get a glimpse of the horrors of this 200 and something like 46 or 47 years of slavery in our country. As soon as the Civil War ended and slaves were free, the reign of terror began. Lynchings began. During slavery, it was unusual to kill one's own slave. You would maybe torture, abuse, obviously, but you wouldn't kill your slave because that was worth too much money. But during lynching, after the end of slavery, lynchings were more common. You obviously read a lot about this from Cone. You had multiple videos about this history. Lynchings were used to terrorize the community, instill fear in these newly liberated Black people in the communities. You looked at someone the wrong way. You didn't step out of someone's way on the sidewalk. You talked to a white woman. You were at risk of being lynched. Men were lynched the most. Women were also lynched, and these were horrific, torturous killings. You have links to some of the images when people would send postcards, take their picture in front of the body and send postcards to their relatives and friends. It's so disturbing and not that far back in our history. At the same time, this was happening, of course, Jim Crow laws were immediately developed, and especially in the southern states, to, in a sense, deal with liberated slaves. The original Reconstruction legislation called for equal representation in government and many steps of reparation, really, to put freed slaves on some sort of footing for betterment and economic development. But very quickly, states' rights took over and put a stop to all of that, and that is the era of Jim Crow. Selma is a great film if you want to know more about at least some parts of that movement, of the civil rights movement. Obviously, it focused specifically on what happened in Selma. But despite the civil rights movement, we still have a culture of white supremacy, and hopefully that's, as you've done these readings, that's becoming clear. Sometimes students aren't particularly aware. We kind of think, oh, we live in this colorblind society, and we have President Obama. We live in this post-racial colorblind culture, but it's absolutely not the case. And lastly here, the new Jim Crow, you have a video and interview with Michelle Wallace. She coined this phrase. Her book is called The New Jim Crow, and everyone uses this term now really to talk about the criminal justice system and what's happening there. I'll talk about that more later in this lecture, and I encourage you, of course, to listen to Michelle Wallace's interview. Brian Stevenson and James Cone all talk about it. James Cone calls the current criminal justice system legal lynching. I think that's a fair assessment. 12% of the population is African American, and nearly 50% of the prison population is Black, right? So 12% of the population in the general population, 50% of the prison population. And as Michelle Wallace points out, more people are currently in the criminal justice, Black people are in the criminal justice system than were ever enslaved. It's shocking. We had multiple readings and videos addressing lynching. My students are oftentimes not familiar with the history of lynching because, as all of our videos say, people aren't aware of it because people just don't talk about it. And so, they talk about slavery as if it ended forever ago, and then, then suddenly it's just the civil rights movement and everything's hunky-dory. People really aren't talking about this history. And yet, it's there, it's in the culture. People know that what the noose represents. And they still show up, right, in different places to make a statement. So I wanted to just highlight a few recent displays of the noose. This is a picture of James Meredith being shot on one of his marches. This was the March Against Fear, right, for a Black man to walk alone in the South, in Mississippi, in rural areas. To walk alone is to be utterly at risk. And he was shot for doing so. Before that, he desegregated Ole Miss, of course, the University of Mississippi, sort of the bastion of the white South. He he is commemorated at Ole Miss here. With this statue of him walking in, right, through the pillars, a statue showing his work to desegregate the university. And in February of 2014, his statue was draped in this flag. It might as well be draping it in the Confederate flag, right? And a noose around his neck. 2014. So he was a civil rights leader in the South, and here his statue is wrapped in a noose just 2 years ago. Same month, I came across this news story. Here are wrestlers, high school wrestlers in New Jersey, who have dressed up a black inflatable dummy with the team that they're going to be wrestling against. New Jersey has a large African American population, and this school has a significant African American population, and so here they have dressed up this dummy in their opponent's t-shirt and hung him from a noose. And then the hoodies are, I think, meant to sort of look like Ku Klux Klan hood. But of course, they're posing with the lynching, like you see people posing in lynching photographs. If you go back and look at that without sanctuary sites, people, lots of images like this. And then, of course, before this, other nooses that were referenced in the Cohn interview, one placed on a Columbia University professor's door, and the famous hanging of these nooses from a tree in Jena, Louisiana. There's a lot of history around that event. If you're curious, look up the Jena 6. Now I want to spend a little time talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, really just by highlighting some of the cases in recent years that have brought this movement to the fore and has ignited this movement across our country. So I'm really just going to talk about these men who've been shot by police, and usually there is no indictment for the shooter. Tamir Rice was 12 years old, sitting on a swing in a park, and a 911 caller called in to say that there was a young male with a gun on a swing, sort of pointing it at people that pass by. The caller did say that's probably a juvenile and that it's probably fake, but that they thought that the police should probably check it out. Anyways, the officers showed up, and they didn't receive apparently all of this information about it probably being a juvenile, probably fake, let's hope, because as soon as they arrived, as you see here, within 2 seconds of arriving, before the car had even come to a complete stop, an officer shot Tamir Rice in the abdomen and did not administer first aid, and he died. Neither officer were indicted. If you live in the Chicago area, or even here, you are familiar with probably with LaQuan McDonald in his case, the video of his shooting It was just released recently, and there were demonstrations throughout Chicago as a result. He was 17 years old, was shot in 2014, but the footage was just released this year. Did a little reading on LaQuan yesterday, and his history and his upbringing is so tragic. And it's true he had had many run-ins with the law up until this. If you read his history, you would have some compassion on him. He went through through the foster care system. His mother was a drug addict. His mother's mother also was, and so she went through the foster care system herself as well. And LaQuan was in one foster home, but he was sexually abused there. He ended up being cared for by his great-grandmother, off and on when he wasn't in the system. When he was shot, he was armed with a 3-inch knife. And he was acting up, certainly, but he was armed with a 3-inch knife. Officers shot him from the car. He was walking away. He was walking away from the police across the street. You can see the video online. And first he was shot by the officer, and he fell to the ground, but he moved. And then when he moved, the officer proceeded to unload his weapon, shooting him 16 times from only 10 feet away. Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore in 2015. He was 25 years old. He was apparently arrested for possessing an illegal switchblade, and there's a lot of debate as to whether or not this switchblade was even illegal. It's apparently legal in Baltimore, but there's some particular code in Baltimore that says this particular kind of spring-loaded knife is not legal in Baltimore itself. So there's a lot of debate around that, but there's also, it's questionable why he was arrested to begin with, because it was after he was arrested they discovered it on him. So it's not clear that they had even really any charges against him when they first brought him into custody. So, he was handcuffed, placed in the back of a van, and then driven, and then not secured there in the back of the van. And the police intentionally drove all over the place, making very abrupt stops, very abrupt turns, so as to throw him all over the back of the van. And with his hands cuffed behind him, of course, he was unable to break his fall or protect himself at all. And the result was that he had a severe spinal injury that sent him into a coma. And so instead of then taking him to the police station, they ended up taking him to a trauma center. It was determined that he was killed by something called a rough ride. There's a name for this, and it has already resulted. They already knew that it would result in deaths and spinal injuries and paralysis, right? It could break your neck, damage your spine, and he was possibly arrested for having a switchblade in his pocket. And the next thing you know, he's being tortured in the back of a van and dies. And as of yet, there is not an indictment. Of course, before all of this was Trayvon Martin. Sort of the beginning, I think, of this movement, really. He was not, of course, shot by police, but by George Zimmerman, a neighborhood watch. Trayvon was 17 years old. This happened in 2012. He was walking home in a gated community that his father's fiance lived in. and he had gone to the 7-Eleven to get his father's fiance's son a bag of Skittles and gotten himself an Arizona iced tea and was walking back to the house when George Zimmerman saw him, called 911. Apparently he called 911 a lot. If you look up the history of this case. He said there was someone suspicious in the neighborhood, and that Trayvon that saw him sort of slowly following him in the car. And so, this is on the 911 call. Trayvon starts to run away, probably because someone is slowly following him in a car, and he's alone. So at that point, Zimmerman tells the dispatch, "Well, he's running. I'm going to try to stop him or something." And the dispatch says, "We need you to do that. We don't need you to do that. You don't need to go chase him down." But he did, and a altercation ensues, which results in George Zimmerman fatally shooting Trayvon Martin. Initially, Zimmerman, he was brought in, but he was never charged with anything because of the stand your ground law in Florida. Eventually was tried, but found not guilty based upon this stand your ground law. Zimmerman is back in the news this week because he is claiming that he is going to auction the gun with which he killed Trayvon Martin. What is terrifying is that someone's going to buy that gun because it was used to kill this boy. Of course, you're probably familiar with Michael Brown and what happened in Ferguson following his shooting. Michael Brown was 18. Accounts differ dramatically on what happened that afternoon. So I'm kind of going to give a little bit of both sides as best I can here. It is certain that Brown did shoplift a few boxes of cigarillos at a local convenience store. There's footage of that. It's not clear that the officer that stops him for jaywalking knew that he was the one who had shoplifted the cigarillos. Either way, he does encounter, Officer Wilson does stop Brown and his friend. They were walking in the middle of the street, not impeding traffic, but walking in the street, and they have some kind of contact, at which, according to the officer's report, Brown and his friend reach into the car through the window and try to get his gun away from him. The Officer Wilson did, if you look up images, there was a fake image circulating a long time, and some of my students last semester came up across that image and thought it was him, with like super black eyes and puffy face and all this. That is not him. If you find that picture, that's not Officer Wilson. Wilson did have, maybe like kind of a pink cheek or jaw. Nothing that dramatic, but perhaps there was some kind of tussle in the car. Eventually, Johnson and Brown leave and flee, and so in this sense, they are probably resisting arrest or something like that. And at some point, Brown turns back around and walks back to the officer. Some reports say that his hands were up, as if in surrender. Many witnesses say that, but there's some debate about it. Regardless, he is walking back toward Officer Wilson unarmed, and he is not charging him. He is simply walking, and Wilson shot him 12 times. Again, and he's an unarmed individual, shot 12 times. His body lay in the street for hours, and this was very upsetting to the community. Protests erupted. The history in Ferguson is unique. If you listen to the Michelle Alexander interview, I have two. There's the lengthy one with Bill Moyers, and there's another one where she talks about what happened in Ferguson and talking to her son. She talks a little bit about the history in Ferguson and the struggles with the police department there, the number of tickets that African Americans would receive for jaywalking, things like that. Disproportionate, just horrifically disproportionate, and then that a large percentage of Americans lived there, but almost no African Americans were in the police force or in government. And so there was a lot of strife in the community already when this happened. And then when there were protests, the city brought in militarized police forces with basically, riot gear and tear gas and armed vehicles, and it just escalated. You're probably also familiar with Eric Garner. He was 43 years old. He was suspected of selling individual cigarettes. Hard way to make a living, I would imagine, and certainly illegal. Probably, not worth killing someone over. Again, just like shoplifting some cigarillos is a minor offense when all is said and done. There's no evidence he was actually selling cigarettes at the time of his arrest, but he was known to do this. He had been arrested multiple times for selling cigarettes in this area. He is resisting arrest, saying, I'm not doing anything. What are you taking me in for? I don't even have anything on me. So he's really frustrated that he feels like he's being harassed, that he's constantly being heckled and sort of harassed by officers there in Staten Island. So they immediately just go to arrest him, and the officer places him in a chokehold, which is against police code there in New York City. He says 11 times in the video that he can't breathe, or to let him breathe, give him breath. His very last words were, "I can't breathe." The medical examiner did rule it a homicide due to the chokehold, but the officer was not indicted. And this is another example of the video that we have of these and why so many people are calling for dash cams, for body cameras on officers, to hold them accountable. If you're at all familiar with the Rodney King trial and the Rodney King beating back in the 90s and the riot that ensued in LA after the police were not indicted in that beating, it also was all because of a video. If there hadn't been a video, there would have been no evidence of the abuse. And we see this again and again throughout these incidents. I had a student ask me last semester, why is it all of a sudden that we're seeing all these, all this police violence or all of these shootings? And it is not that there's more. It's just that we now have video cameras on cell phones, and so it's getting a lot more publicity. In fact, if you look at the Sharon Welch reading from a few weeks ago, look back at Sharon Welch, page 174. This book was published around 1990, so it's a little bit dated, and so the research here is from a study that was published in 1992. But one of her footnotes says, between 1976 and 1987, the most recent period studied, some 1,800 black persons and about 3,000 whites were killed by law enforcement officers. So given their proportion of population, black Americans have a 3 times greater chance than whites of dying from a policeman's bullet. That's from Two Nations, Black and White, Separate, Hostile, and Unequal by Andrew Hacker. So, so my student asked, why is this happening so much more? And as you see here in the Sharon Welch reading, that no, even, in this study from the 70s into the 80s, blacks were still 3 times more likely to die from a police bullet than whites. So it's not a new phenomenon. It's just getting more publicity because we now have evidence to show what really happened in some of these instances anyways. Khalif Browder is a different case. I'm not sure if you will have heard of him. There were some stories published on him in the New Yorker that brought his case to light and got some publicity. He committed suicide last year. When he was 16 years old, he was walking home with a friend from a party late at night, and the police stopped him there in sort of Little Italy area and searched them. They didn't find anything on them, but apparently then they went back. This is his testimony. They went back to the car and they said, we didn't take anything. I don't know what you're talking about. We didn't do anything. We're just coming home. We're just walking home. And then apparently the victim of this backpack robbery said, oh, they didn't just do this tonight. They did it 2 weeks ago. So based upon this witness, if you will, they are taken in to the police station. The cop at the time says, oh, they'll probably just let you go home after this, but, we need to take you in. Because Khalif was on probation at the time, he was not released to just go home after this. The judge said that he had to come up with $3,000 bail because he was accused of this crime. There was no evidence, no backpack, but he didn't have $3,000 to pay the bail. So they sent him to Rikers Island, very hard, over full prison. And he remained there he was 16, right? He remained there for 3 years. And I should maybe say he's on probation because he was somehow involved with taking a truck and going on a joyride with a friend or something along these lines. He was not put in juvenile detention or anything. He was just put, it's kind of given a warning. Wasn't on his record. He was just sort of, watch out, because he was so young at the time. So it wasn't as if he'd done something truly horrific or something and was on probation or had served time before this. Nonetheless, so someone accused him of stealing a backpack, which there was never any evidence for, but because he couldn't pay the bail, he had to stay in prison until his trial, where they would find there is no evidence, we have to let him go. But his trial kept getting pushed back and pushed back. So he was in prison for 3 years, awaiting trial, and 2 years of that time was spent in solitary confinement. When he wasn't in solitary, he was beaten. One of the reasons they keep juveniles often in solitary is because they're the most likely to be raped. So, suffered horrific abuses in prison, 2 years in solitary confinement, which plays with your head, and this is known if you watch the videos that I posted for this week. There is evidence. In fact, they finally said you're not, at a federal level, you're not allowed to put juveniles in solitary confinement. Now, what you're going to do with juveniles, because you don't want to put them out in the regular prison population because they're going to be horrifically abused. But it plays with your mind, and most people become suicidal, and especially juveniles. I don't know most, but it's almost expected. And of course, Khalif did become suicidal and attempted it multiple times while he was in prison. And once he was released, he did eventually hang himself in his parents' home. Imagine a 16-year-old white kid getting taken in over someone claiming that they took a backpack a couple weeks ago. No evidence of it, no backpack. Someone just says this in the dark, oh, that's him, you know. And then they spend 3 years in a really rough facility awaiting trial. Right? There is a horrible racial disparity in our criminal justice system, and obviously it's both racial and it's class. I mean, he didn't have the money for bail, so there was nothing he could do, nothing his family could do. We're going to now talk about really some of these statistics, and I've got a lot of stat slides, and hopefully I don't kill you with stats. This stat shows the perception of different communities of how they think they're treated, whether it's fairly as on equal to how whites are treated, or saying are blacks in their community treated less fairly than whites. In dealings with police, 37% of whites think that blacks are not treated fairly, right? They're less fairly than whites. Blacks, 70%. And in a sense, I'm surprised it's not higher than that. And Hispanics agree, 51%, that blacks are not treated as fairly as whites. In the court system, whites, only 27% see a racial bias in the court system. Blacks see a different situation. The workforce, in restaurants, in schools, in healthcare, whites assume, most of them, that everyone gets the same healthcare, right? Your doctor would treat you the same. Again, blacks know a different story. 47% do not think that you get the same healthcare, and this is true. Study after study, an abundance of studies demonstrate that people of color do not receive the same treatment as whites from the same hospital, from the same doctor. There is a very strong racial bias in our healthcare system. And again, there are many studies. I encourage you to look it up. The studies conclude that this actually contributes to poorer health for people of color and poorer life expectancy, as they do not receive as good of care. This slide shows income disparity, and I especially wanted to highlight how little has changed since the 60s, right? You think, oh, we're so much better off, than right on the cusp of, the civil rights in 1967. The divide in wealth, or in income rather, here, wealth is even worse, we'll look at that on the next slide, of income hasn't improved, right? Has not improved over all of these years. And you might as well also look at the Hispanic numbers in all of these slides as well. I'm not going to repeat these slides when we get to the Latino and Latina context next week. So, take a look at these figures both for the African American context and for the Latina context. Net worth. So this, includes property, wealth, not just income, right? We think about, the recession, the Great Recession, right, that hit kind of in 2008. Wow, that just devastated our country. But then you look at the loss in net worth of the white population, and look at the loss in net worth of the Hispanic and the Black population of our country. More than half. They lost more than half of their assets, of their net worth. Massive loss and suffering, especially by people of color in these times of recession. This slide has to do with not poverty, how many children live in poverty necessarily, but in areas of concentrated poverty. So ghetto kind of poverty, right? Really impoverished neighborhoods. 45% of poor children, so that's of those who are under the poverty line, right? Almost 50% of children below the poverty line who are Black live in extremely poor neighborhoods. And the American Indian population, similarly very high, and the Hispanic population, very high, right? So there's centers of poverty. And what this is highlighting is that the communities and the neighborhoods where these groups live is surrounded by this kind of despairing situation. Part of the reason for this, it does have to do with incarceration rates. All of our multiple the videos that you watched for this week highlight this dramatic increase in confinement in prison system. Look at the jump from 1960 to 2010. And this is per 100,000 residents. And I'm just kind of sitting here letting you take it in. Obviously, we have many more men in the prison system than women, but notice still the numbers of Blacks, 12% of the population, right? But look at, even under the women, how many more Black women are incarcerated. These are some stats from Michelle Alexander's book. People of color make up 30% of the overall population in the United States, but 60% of the prison population. The likelihood of Black males going to prison is 28%. In some states, there is a 1 in 3 chance that if you are a Black man, that you will be imprisoned. The likelihood of a Hispanic male going to prison is 16%. Oh, I have a typo there, sorry. While the likelihood of a white male going to prison is only 4%. In some states, 90% of those arrested and convicted of drug offenses are Black. Although we know that Blacks are not a higher percentage of drug users. 1/2 of the penal population right? And this is a stat that Cohn mentioned, and that I mentioned previously, that they're nearly, but apparently they are now half of the penal population, and still, again, only 12% of the population. Blacks receive 10% longer sentences than whites for the same crime, and they are 20% more likely to be sent to prison for the same crime than whites. Let's just look at some of the stats in Iowa. Iowa actually has some of the, is among the worst. You'd think that it would be Mississippi or something like that. But Iowa is listed as the worst in some of these categories. A black person is 8 times more likely to be arrested for simple marijuana possession than a white person. This is the highest racial disparity rate in the country. A 2007 study found Iowa also worse in the ratio of blacks to whites in prison. Incarceration rates of 13.6 times more likely than whites, which is the national average is closer to 6 times. Blacks in Iowa are only 3.3% of the population, but more than a quarter of the prison population. 9.4% of black men in Iowa are currently incarcerated. That is the third worst in the nation. That means they're currently in prison, not just in the system. Blacks are arrested over 9 times more often than whites. And Bettendorf, of all of the cities in Iowa, has the highest disparity. A black person in Bettendorf is almost 10 times more likely to be arrested. There is also a huge disparity when it comes to the death penalty. You are much more likely to be charged with the death penalty for the prosecutor to pursue the death penalty if you're black. 48% of those charged are black, 29% Hispanic, and 20% white. Prosecutors pursue the death penalty in cases where they think they can get it. So they usually will pursue it if the person is a person of color, especially black, and especially if the victim is white. Oftentimes prosecutors, to have a capital case somehow is, to win a capital case is considered good. So they pursue it in these cases. The race of the victims play a huge role. Like I said before, that if the victims are white, you're much more likely to get the death penalty. 70% of the victims in death penalty cases resulting in executions are white, right? The victim, even though African Americans are actually half of all of the homicide victims. 6% of the victims were Hispanic, and 15% of the victims were African American, right? And this study at Yale basically kind of reiterates this. African American defendants receive the death penalty at 3 times the rate of white defendants in cases where the victims are black. So even when it's a white-on-white crime, blacks would still be 3 times more likely to receive the death penalty. And killers of white victims are treated more severely than people who kill minorities. Again, it's kind of all about the same thing. If you're a white person, you're much more likely to have harsher sentencing. Blacks and Latinos are 3 times more likely to be searched by police. when stopped than white people are. 3 times more likely to be searched, even though whites are more likely to have drugs or guns, illegal weapons, actually are more likely to have it on them or in their car. So blacks and Latinos are so routinely stopped and searched. Their cars are searched illegally. Black men are twice as likely to be arrested. And we saw so many examples of that, that Eric Garner was being arrested. It's not even clear exactly why, that Eddie Gray was arrested and then they found this blade on him. But then they, just for having a knife on his body, gave him the rough ride that resulted in his death. Nice. Black men are 4 times more likely to experience use of force in encounters with police. We sort of saw some examples of that again in our Black Lives Matter section. 14% of drug users are black, but make up 37% of those arrested for drug offenses. I mentioned this earlier when one of the previous slides where it talked about drug arrests, that blacks do not do more drugs. It's not as if, it's kind of like this idea of stopping a black man and checking him for drugs, even though a white man would be more likely to have it on him. 14% of drug users are black, but 30% of those arrested on drug offenses. And something that I've been coming across a lot is the use of jaywalking as a way to, in a sense, harass the black population in certain cities, giving them fines and tickets for jaywalking, which of course we're talking about primarily a poor population that will then struggle to pay these fines and then get more fines, and then suddenly you're getting arrested for misdemeanor jaywalking fines. A study showed that in Champaign-Urbana, 89% of those arrested for jaywalking are black and are only 16% of the population. Also, what's interesting is that these towns, apparently there aren't a lot of sidewalks, so it's particularly strange of this strong enforcement of jaywalking when there aren't sidewalks in most of the neighborhoods. But that is definitely a way of harassing a population, and it is racial profiling. Unfortunately, for many youth of color, this process begins at a very young age because they begin receiving these contacts with law enforcement at a very young age. See, 70% of arrests and referrals to law enforcement in schools are for students of color. So they begin this path at a young age. It's all around them. It's in their communities. It's in their schools. 2/5 of confined youth are black. 1/5 of confined youth are Hispanic. So 60% of juvenile detention are of color, while only 30% of the population. And 58% of black youth in the system are sent to adult prisons. Hopefully, if you've watched the videos that I posted and the interviews I posted, you find this particularly disturbing. There are many other videos by Brian Stevenson that I want to post. He has many heartbreaking and powerful stories to tell. He tells one story about a young boy who was put in an adult prison at age 14, and when Brian came to see him the next day, he was a wreck. He had been raped 4 times his first night in prison. And if you are interested in hearing the story, obviously it's terribly upsetting, but hearing about Brian's encounters with this boy, you could probably find it under Chocolate Milkshake, Brian Stevenson Chocolate Milkshake, because the boy just asked him to bring him a chocolate milkshake every time he came to visit him in prison. Once you put a child in that kind of context and they begin to endure this kind of abuse, you're changing the course of that individual's development, and their likelihood to then become criminals. Brian Stevenson talks in some of the videos that I also posted about sentencing of youth to life in prison without parole, right? So 14, 15-year-olds sentenced to spend the rest of their entire life in prison without ever hope of rehabilitation, of getting out. He talks, and so does Michelle Alexander, about for-profit prisons. We have given over our prison systems to capitalism and to for-profit industries that require a certain occupancy rate. And, one terrible and fascinating story, there's a documentary called Cash for Kids about a judge in a juvenile court system. Not unrelated to the previous slides on the criminal justice system is employment. Michelle Alexander mentions that once someone is a drug offender or a felon you can just be a felon drug offender for multiple drug possessions, it is nearly impossible for you to find a job. So she talks about Ban the Box campaign, where you do not allow a box on a job application, because you'll see something, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And to ban the box means to not allow that to be on the application, because having that on there means that this huge percentage of the Black male population will never be able to work. She talks about how they are then also locked out of public housing when they come out of prison. They're locked out of student loans when they come out of prison, so they can't get a job, they can't get a home, and they can't go back to school. So what are they going to do? Right? So the system perpetuates itself. It's created to keep them confined, to keep them in the prison system, because there is no way out if they're locked out of these things. And then they're not allowed to serve on juries. And then they're not allowed to vote. In most states, or many states, you're not allowed to vote if you're convicted of a felony. So this huge percentage of the Black population, specifically the Black male population, are not on juries, are not able to vote. So their voice, their representation is silenced in our country. And again, obviously, a new form of Jim Crow. If you think of Jim Crow, one of the things of Jim Crow was voter laws to keep Blacks from going to the polls, to keep Blacks from voting. Well, here is a way that Blacks are still kept from voting, kept from having representation on juries, and so on. All right, so employment. One study showed that when a Black man applies for a job, he has a 14% chance of getting a callback, while a white man with an identical resume has a 34% chance. And there's quite a few studies of this, that if they have the exact resume, but they put a white-sounding name, John Smith, and a black sounding name, LaQuan McDonald, on an application that people don't call back the person with the black name. If a black man without a criminal record applies for a job, he has a 5% chance of getting a callback, while a white man with a criminal record has a 17% chance of getting a callback. I know that these stats are different, but obviously they're done with the different studies. So in this study, a black man without a criminal record, right, so he doesn't check I'm a felon or whatever, only a 5% chance of getting a callback. But a white man with a criminal record, 17% chance. That stat is quoted quite often. It should be shocking to you. This is the annual unemployment rates from 1963 to 2012. Again, notice the unemployment rate for blacks has always been much higher even than the recession itself. All right. Well, there is a lot. There was a lot of information there. I know this lecture has already gone quite long, but that's just some of the background. Obviously, we didn't get into slavery. We barely touched on the history of lynching. We're just touching barely, the surface of these issues. But all of this feeds into the need for a black voice in the development of Christian theology, of the way we talk about God, the way we understand God, the way we understand Christianity, the doctrines of the church. What do these mean in the way we live in the world? And we need to hear the voice of the marginalized. We need to hear the voice of the oppressed, because that is where God resides, right, with the oppressed. So a few things about black theology specifically. It approaches theology in a somewhat unique way. Oftentimes, black theologians will draw from African religious traditions, having come from African religions originally, right? So oftentimes they will draw some ideas and have that inform their Christian interpretation of Christian doctrine, Christian thought, Christian interpretation of the Bible. They'll use ideas or themes from African religions. This isn't unlike white theologians like Thomas Aquinas using Aristotle. He used Aristotle all over the place in his theology. He used a non-Christian Greek philosopher to interpret Christian doctrine, and so it's really just the same thing. Here, a black liberation theologian, a black theologian would use a different philosophy to interpret the Christian faith. Same thing, but just a different source. Often we'll use slave spirituals and slave narratives. These songs and stories, perseverance and resilience and hope and strength are woven through many of these theologies. I mentioned in the last lecture a theologian from Duke named J. Cameron Carter, who did that work on the racialization of Christian theology and how Christianity has sort of separated itself from the Jewishness of Jesus. He, in that book, that massive book, he uses some slave narratives to develop his theology there in a really interesting way. Cone obviously uses blues and jazz, as well as the Gospels and the slave spirituals. He, in the interview that I posted with Bill Moyers, he talks about the significance of the Gospels and also the significance of the blues, and how these songs sort of assure people that they have a humanity and that they have self-transcendence, that they transcend beyond the situation, the worldly situation where they find themselves, right? That they have this humanity that is given to them from God. Use of a literature from the Black community. Womanism, which we're going to talk about next time, is theology written by Black women. And so oftentimes there will be references to literature written by Black women or Black men. So Zora Neale Hurston, Toni Morrison, Alice Walker, just to name a few. Their stories are woven into their theology. Obviously, there's a focus on the Exodus narrative. You already read an article by Cone where he talks about how important that history of Yahweh going into a covenant relationship with these liberated, homeless ex-slaves, right? That this tells us who God is, what God is about. God is identified as the one who liberates slaves and enters into a binding covenant with these liberated, homeless, wandering, oppressed people. Also make a lot of use of the prophets in the Old Testament. Cone walks you through many different prophets in that reading from the first week of class. The prophets were the voice of God to Israel. So the prophets spoke God's words. If you were to pick up a book of the prophets, you would, read them. And God says, quote, and Yahweh says, care for the poor, learn to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. So it's as if they're quoting God. So they are the voice box of God. And the prophets again and again and again call Israel to care for the poor and the needy, the homeless. All right, here's a picture of James Cone. You're already, if you've watched the interview, already seen him. But I just want to say a few things about him. He grew up in segregated Arkansas, went to a segregated school. And he was in graduate school in the 60s. He was in graduate school when Malcolm X was assassinated and when Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. And the anger that he felt for these leaders in the Black community that were giving voice to the people that they were shot down obviously angered him, as it should. And he immediately wrote, and quite quickly wrote, his first book in the midst of that, called Black Theology and Black Power, which was really probably the first real example of Black liberation theology as we know it today. He has written many, many books since then. And the most recent book is The Cross and the Lynching Tree, which is what we focus on our dealings with him here in this class this term. But I did want to just highlight some of the points made in the other article that you read by him for this week on theology's sin and silence in the face of racism. This silence in the face of racism, the complicity of white theologians in white supremacy and the system of racism, their complicity by not speaking out, right, by being silent, because to be neutral and to be silent is to side with the culture of white supremacy. He says it causes spiritual death. This is why I keep emphasizing this, hopefully each week, that all of our authors keep reminding us that work for liberation and speaking out against racism isn't just to, help the poor minority community or something like that. It is to participate in God's work of salvation within ourselves, within the white theologian as well. To not speak out causes spiritual death because of one's complicity in this evil. But why do whites typically not speak about it? Cone has 4 proposals as to why they don't, because they don't have to. It's pretty simple. It is a part of Blacks' everyday experience in our country. It's hard to get around it. But whites just don't have to face it because of white privilege, because of white culture. We're just not faced with our own whiteness. And so we just don't talk about race. Because of guilt, we can become very paralyzed with guilt or focused in on our guilt. Gloria Yamato also mentions this in one of your very first readings from the first week. She says this is a form of racism where we become so self-absorbed with our own guilt that we just sort of internalize everything, and it keeps us from acting. It keeps us from taking the steps we need to take to speak out and work against racism. So guilt, when we focus in too much on it, we're worthless. We're paralyzed. We don't know what to do. Also, because we don't want to engage Black rage. We don't want to talk about it. It's hard. These conversations are hard. And there is anger, and there is righteous anger. There is a reason for there to be rage. I mean, hopefully that's becoming clear, either through the videos, through the lecture, through the readings. There is a reason to be angry if you're a Black person in the United States, and not just because of the legacy of slavery, which is bad enough, obviously, but because of all that has gone on since then that has kept the Black population in a form of bondage. Rules, legislation that continues to keep white dominance. And because, well, why do whites theologians not talk about it? Also because we don't want to give up wealth and we don't want to give up power. At some point, a white theologian would need to say, okay, I'm going to step back and I'm going to listen. Maybe I shouldn't be the president of this organization. Maybe I shouldn't be hired in, that position, because maybe it is important that there is diversity in the faculty or diversity at the administrative level. But it's hard to give up. That's why so many people are opposed to affirmative action. Even though hopefully we can recognize that it would be good to have diverse voices around the table, as long as my voice gets to still be at the table, right? So those are all reasons why people don't talk about it. It's hard, and it's not popular. But Cone charges white theologians to break the silence, just start talking about it. We're so worried about saying exactly the right thing. We're going to make mistakes. We got to just do it, speak up, and again, not for the sake of Black poor, but for the soul of our churches and all humanity. Begin the anti-racist struggle wherever you are. You're not going to have it all figured out. You don't have to wait until you've read every single book. Just start today, start now, start where you are. Work at a pace you can sustain your whole life. You don't burn out. Support Black empowerment in society, church, and theology. That's kind of what I was saying previous. It might mean giving up some power. It might mean taking a back seat. Support the empowerment of Blacks and racial minorities across the spectrum of our society. And engage the histories and cultures and the theologies of people of color. Engage them in your work. Reference them. Let their ideas influence you and your work. And you're enrolled in this class already, so that's, a good start. Lastly, the cross and the lynching tree. This is obviously what he was talking with Bill Moyers about for most of the lecture, his book and the article that you read. So I just wanted to highlight a few things. A powerful interview and a powerful article there on this comparison between the cross and the lynching tree. Of course, the cross was a public spectacle, execution, torturous, long and drawn out. public, right, out on a crossroads where people would commonly be walking by. And it was there to terrorize the Roman subjects, people who were occupied the Roman Empire. They would be passing by and they would see these people dying this long, slow, agonizing death, and it would strike fear in them. Don't mess with the empire, really, right? So it's to terrorize and control. If you're a Roman citizen, you would not be crucified. So it was reserved for the subject in the society, the despised in the society, those who were ruled and dominated. So you see there the comparison between a lynching and its purpose, the purpose that this lynching tree served, the noose served to strike fear in the Black community, to control. And again, of course, the public spectacle and so on. But how can we interpret the lynching tree through the cross? And so Cone talks about how the cross is a tragedy, which we're not used to reading about, and I probably could go into much more detail about that. We'd have to get into some heavy doctrine and theology, which I don't know that we have time for, since I've already been lecturing for an hour and 15 minutes at this point. But he calls the cross itself, right, the public torturous execution of Christ, a tragedy, but beautiful. And there's beauty that comes out of it, because it is through this that God suffers in solidarity with all crucified people, right? In Christ suffering there, God suffers, and it's in solidarity with all of the oppressed, with all of those who are, in a sense, then crucified. And it gives power. Somehow this cross gives power. It is a victory out of defeat, right? The resurrection. Death doesn't have the final word. The lynchings don't have the final word. The lyncher doesn't get the last word. And the cross shows that God is power in the powerless. The cross looks like powerlessness. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said that the cross looks like powerlessness to the world. But it is in this that God's power is unleashed to free us and to liberate us from our spiritual bondage. God gives power to resist the definitions placed upon one by others, power to declare one's own humanity. That was something else that was emphasized in the Cone interview, that it's this power to resist the definition that society places upon you, that you're worthless, that you're ugly, that you're nothing. And it is the power of God revealed in the cross that says, no, you are a child of God. Right? And it is the cross that gives the power for centuries of blacks in the United States who resist and who insist that they are in the image of God, who insist that they are fully human, deserving of dignity. And he mentions the 246 years of slavery, another more than 100 years of lynching terror, and now the new Jim Crow, which he calls legal lynchings. Yet the Black community has hope and resilience, and it finds the power to resist and to keep resisting a culture of white supremacy that tries to hold them down and tell them that they're nothing. This, Cone says, is the power of the cross. And that is how the lynching tree and the cross interpret each other. To look at the lynching tree and see the power of God, to see Christ there, right? Insist that the lyncher and the death does not have the final say, but God.